Welcome to Echo and Ash, and thank you for tuning in to another original audio experience. Today, we are continuing the storyline titled Dead Embers. This is episode 3. Please sit back, relax, and let the story unfold.
The cold was no longer just a temperature. It was a physical entity, a predatory force gnawing at the exposed slivers of skin around Caleb Thorne's thermal goggles. He had been climbing for over an hour through the blinding whiteout, his snowshoes biting into the ever-deepening powder with rhythmic, agonizing effort. The wind screamed through the ancient Douglas firs, carrying ice crystals that hit his heavy parka like buckshot. Every breath Caleb drew felt like inhaling broken glass. His lungs burned, but his legs pumped with the steady, mechanical endurance of a man who had spent his entire life conquering this mountain. Yet despite his familiarity with Blackwood Ridge, the forest felt entirely alien tonight. Normally, a winter storm of this magnitude would push the wildlife into survival patterns. Caleb would expect to see the tracks of snowshoe hares diving for cover beneath deadfall, or the deep, desperate trenches left by mule deer seeking the lower valleys. Tonight, there was nothing. The snow was a blank, pristine canvas, devoid of the frantic scribbles of animal life. It was as if the ecosystem had sensed a shift in the air long before the blizzard hit and had simply evacuated. The unnatural silence beneath the howling wind set Caleb's teeth on edge. He checked his wrist GPS, the small blue screen illuminating the swirling snow. He was close. The coordinates of the impact were less than a quarter mile away, just over the next topographical shelf. He unslung the heavy bolt-action rifle from his shoulder, holding it across his chest as he pushed through a dense thicket of frosted pines. The air abruptly changed. The clean, sharp scent of pine needles and ozone was aggressively replaced by the toxic, acrid stench of burning aviation fuel, scorched metal, and something else, a heavy, coppery smell like old blood and ammonia. Caleb crested the ridge, and the crash site materialized out of the storm like a jagged wound in the earth. The aircraft had clipped the tops of the ancient pines, snapping trunks 2 feet thick as if they were toothpicks, before slamming into the rocky, snow-covered incline. It was a de Havilland twin otter, a rugged twin-engine workhorse designed for short takeoffs and harsh environments. But this one was wrong. There were no corporate logos, no vibrant stripes to make it visible against the snow. It was painted a flat, light-absorbing matte black, and the tail numbers had been hastily sprayed over with dark primer. It was a ghost plane, flying blind in a blizzard to avoid radar detection. The left wing had been entirely sheared off, resting in a smoldering ruin 50 yards up the slope. The main fuselage was crumpled, the nose buried deep into a granite outcropping. Small, stubborn fires licked at the torn metal, hissing violently as the heavy snow tried to smother them. Jesus, Caleb breathed, his voice swallowed by the gale. He pulled the satellite phone from his pocket. The screen flashed, searching for signal. The storm was too thick, the cloud cover too dense. He was entirely cut off. If he was going to find anyone alive in that twisted metal, he had to do it alone, and he had to do it now. Caleb strapped the phone back into his coat and drew his heavy steel crowbar. He approached the wreckage cautiously, scanning the perimeter. The heat radiating from the burning fuselage was intense, melting the snow into muddy pools that immediately began to refreeze into slick, black ice. He made his way to the crumpled cockpit. The reinforced windshield was completely shattered. Caleb aimed his heavy-duty headlamp into the dark interior. The pilot was dead. pinned violently against the instrument panel by the crushed steering column. But as the beam of Caleb's light washed over the man's face, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach that had nothing to do with the trauma of the crash. The pilot's neck was broken, his head lolling at an unnatural angle, yet his face was contorted into a terrifying, rigid snarl. His lips were pulled back so far his gums were exposed, and his teeth were stained with dark blood. Around his mouth, a thick, white, frothy residue had frozen solid against his chin. Even more disturbing were his hands. The pilot was missing his heavy winter gloves, and his fingernails were torn and bloody. The fabric of his own jacket had been shredded, revealing deep self-inflicted gouges along his forearms, as if he had been trying to claw something out from beneath his own skin before the plane went down. This wasn't a man who had died in a panic, trying to pull up on the yoke. This was a man who had already lost his mind before the mountain ever got in his way. Caleb swallowed hard. Stepping back from the cockpit, he moved along the side of the fuselage toward the cargo door, which had been warped and blown partially open by the impact. Down in the valley, the town of Oakhaven was a grid of total darkness. The municipal power substation had finally succumbed to the ice, plunging the entire community into the freezing black. Inside the sheriff's station, the emergency backup generator hummed to life, casting a harsh, fluorescent glare over the dispatch room. Sheriff Elias Vance stood over the main radio console, an unlit cigar clamped between his teeth, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Beside him, Ranger Maya Lin was pacing, the radio microphone gripped tightly in her hand. "Still nothing," Maya said, her voice tight with frustration. She released the transmit button. "It's been over an hour. Even with the snow, Caleb should have reached the crash site by now." "Storm interference," Elias grunted, though his eyes betrayed his worry. "Satellite phones need a clear line of sight to the sky. With this cloud cover and the snowfall, he might not get a ping until the front passes." "Or he fell into a ravine," Maya countered, stopping her pacing to glare at the radio as if it had personally offended her. The door to the dispatch room opened and Dr. Aris Thorne walked in. He was wearing a heavy wool coat over his scrubs, his face pale and drawn. He carried a thermos of coffee and a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. "Any word from him?" Aris asked, setting the thermos on the console. "Not yet, Doc," Elias said softly. "He's likely on scene. Just can't get a signal out to tell us." Aris nodded, though the comfort didn't reach his eyes. He opened the manila folder, spreading a series of printed reports across the desk next to the radio. Maya looked down at them. They were medical bulletins stamped with the logo of the World Health Organization. "What is all this, Aris?" Maya asked. "I couldn't sleep," Aris admitted, rubbing his temples. "I went back to the clinic and pulled the latest secured data on that Lyssavirus anomaly the news has been talking about. The one out of the Congo." Elias frowned, pulling the cigar from his mouth. "Aris, this is not the time for an epidemiology lecture. Your brother is out in a blizzard." "I know," Aris said, his voice rising a fraction in defensive anxiety. "But look at the vector reports, Elias. The outbreak didn't start in a populated city. It started deep in the jungle, near illegal logging camps, and it's spreading through the illicit wildlife trade. Smugglers are bringing infected animals, primates, exotic birds, bushmeat, across borders before the symptoms fully manifest." "Okay," Maya said slowly, trying to follow his logic, "and that matters to us. Why? We're in Washington State." Aris tapped a specific paragraph on the top page. Because the CDC just flagged a series of intercepted shipping manifests. They grounded all commercial flights out of Kinshasa, but the black market doesn't file flight plans. They charter private, untraceable aircraft to move exotic animals to private buyers in North America. They fly low under the radar, dropping cargo in remote areas. Elias stared at the doctor, the pieces slowly clicking together in his veteran mind. A dark, unmarked plane flying through a blizzard in the dead of night. A catastrophic crash on a remote mountain ridge. "Are you telling me," Elias rumbled, his voice dropping an octave, "that the plane Caleb is walking up to right now might be a smuggler's run?" "I don't know," Aris said, his voice barely a whisper. "But if it is, and if they were carrying infected cargo, Caleb isn't just dealing with a crash site. He might be walking into a biological hazard." High on Blackwood Ridge, Caleb pried the warped cargo door open with a brutal heave of his crowbar. The metal groaned and snapped, giving way to the dark interior of the plane. Caleb aimed his flashlight inside. The cargo hold was a scene of absolute devastation, but not just from the crash. The plane wasn't carrying drugs or weapons. It was lined with rows of heavy-duty reinforced aluminum transport cages. Most of them had been crushed by the impact, their metal frames twisted into unrecognizable shapes. But as Caleb stepped carefully into the fuselage, the stench of ammonia and blood became overpowering. He shone his light on the closest intact crate. It was plastered with international shipping labels, though the origins had been aggressively scrubbed with chemical solvent. However, a bright red, diamond-shaped sticker remained clearly visible. Biohazard, live animal. Caleb wiped his gloved hand across the front of the cage. The thick steel mesh wasn't just bent from the plane crashing. It was bowed outward. Something inside had thrown itself against the reinforced steel with impossible force. He moved deeper into the hold. Another crate, larger than the rest, lay on its side. The heavy padlocks had been bypassed entirely. The steel door had been literally torn off its hinges, the metal screaming outward, leaving the cage empty. Inside, the floor was slick with dark, freezing blood and clumps of thick, dark fur. A sudden, sharp sound snapped Caleb's attention away from the empty cage. It wasn't the wind, it was a wet, ragged cough. It came from outside the plane, near the sheared-off left wing. Caleb instantly dropped the crowbar and unslung his rifle, thumbing off the safety. He backed out of the fuselage, stepping carefully down into the snow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He followed the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense curtain of falling snow. About 30 yards from the main wreckage, huddled at the base of a shattered pine tree, was a figure. It was a man. He was wearing a heavy aviator jacket, but it was torn to shreds. One of his legs was clearly broken, bent at a horrifying angle, the bone protruding through the dark fabric of his pants. He should have been dead from the trauma alone, or frozen solid within 20 minutes in this temperature. But the man was not freezing. In fact, the snow entirely surrounding him had melted away, leaving a patch of bare, steaming earth. "Hey," Caleb called out, keeping his rifle leveled at the man's chest. "Hey, don't move. I've got a medical kit. I'm going to help you." The man didn't respond to the words. His head snapped up, tracking the source of the light. Caleb stepped closer, the beam of his headlamp illuminating the survivor's face. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The man's skin was an unnatural, ashen gray, yet he was drenched in a thick, steaming sweat. Beneath his skin, a network of dark, bruised veins crawled up his neck and spiderwebbed across his cheeks, pulsing visibly. They got out," the man rasped, His voice sounded like grinding stones. "What got out?" Caleb demanded, stopping 10 feet away. The instincts that had kept him alive in the wild for a decade were screaming at him to turn around and run. This man was not a survivor. He was a vector. "What were you carrying in those crates?" "Kinshasa," the man babbled, his eyes rolling back in his head for a moment before snapping forward, locking on to Caleb with terrifying predatory intensity. "The money, we didn't know. It burned them up, burned their brains. They tore through the steel. I tried to lock the cockpit. God, the heat." The man's jaw clamped shut abruptly. A thick white foam began to bubble past his lips, dripping onto the steaming collar of his jacket. "I have water," Caleb said, reaching slowly toward his pack, trying to de-escalate the strange, primal tension radiating from the broken man. "Let me get you some water, and we can bind that leg." At the word water, the man reacted with violent, terrifying revulsion. He violently thrashed his head side to side, a guttural, animalistic shriek tearing from his throat. The hydrophobia, the classic uncontrollable terror of water caused by advanced Lyssavirus, triggered a massive neurological cascade. The man lunged. He didn't stand up. With a broken leg, standing was impossible. Instead, he propelled himself forward off his hands and his one good leg like a twisted, broken spider, crossing the 10 feet of snow between them with explosive, impossible speed. Caleb had a fraction of a second to react. He didn't fire the rifle. The man was too close, moving too erratically. Instead, Caleb swung the heavy wooden stock of the bolt-action rifle like a baseball bat, driving it directly into the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The impact threw the man to the side, tumbling into a snowdrift. He didn't scream in pain. He didn't even seem to register the blow. He instantly began to scramble to his feet, his broken bone grinding audibly against the rocks, his jaw hanging loose, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of human reason. The virus had entirely consumed his consciousness, leaving nothing but a raging, aggressive instinct to bite, to spread, to burn. As the infected man coiled his muscles to leap again, his body finally betrayed him. The massive trauma of the crash, combined with the catastrophic fever boiling his brain, triggered a sudden, massive cardiovascular collapse. The man stiffened, a final choking gasp rattling in his throat, and then collapsed face first into the snow, motionless. Caleb stood over the body, his chest heaving, his rifle still raised, his finger trembling on the trigger. He waited for a full minute, but the man didn't move. The intense heat radiating from his body began to fade, and the snow slowly began to accumulate on his torn jacket. Caleb backed away, his mind reeling. Aris's voice echoed in his head, a memory of a conversation at the diner just hours ago. Viruses mutate all the time. If an infected animal gets too sick, too fast, it can't hunt, it can't travel. It dies, and the virus dies with it. But this virus hadn't died in the jungle. It had been loaded onto a plane. It had survived the cold. It had given a man with a shattered leg the strength to attack like a rabid wolf. Caleb turned his flashlight back toward the dark, gaping maw of the ruined cargo hold. He walked slowly back to the plane, keeping a wide berth from the dead pilot. He shone his light on the muddy, blood-slicked ground just beneath the torn cargo door. There were tracks. They were large, irregular, and deeply pressed into the mud before the snow had begun to cover them. They didn't belong to a man, and they didn't match the clean, purposeful stride of a wolf or a bear. They were frantic, pacing, aggressive tracks of something heavily muscled and utterly deranged, and they led away from the crash site. Down the steep incline of the ridge, they were heading straight down into the valley, straight toward Oakhaven. Caleb ripped the satellite phone from his pocket. He didn't care about the interference. He held it up toward the sky, watching the signal bar flicker from 0 to 1 weak, fragile bar. He hit redial. Ring, ring, ring. Dispatch, Elias speaking. The heavy voice broke through a wall of static. Elias, Caleb shouted over the howling wind. His eyes locked on the tracks disappearing into the dark woods. Elias, it's the smuggler's plane. They were carrying biological cargo, animals, from Africa. Caleb, slow down. Aris is here. He suspected as much. Did you find survivors? The crew is dead, Caleb yelled, taking a step down the ridge, following the tracks with his light. But the crates are open. Something survived the crash, Elias. Something infected, and it's not staying on the mountain. The static flared loudly, obscuring Elias's response for a terrifying second before his voice cut back in, laced with sudden, cold dread. Caleb, what is it? What's coming down the mountain? I don't know, Caleb said, the wind threatening to tear the phone from his grip. He looked down at the massive, bloody prints filling rapidly with fresh snow. But whatever it is, it's massive, it's rabid, and it's headed right for town.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the story, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for the continuation of this series, as Caleb discovers their mountain fortress is not so isolated. Until then, stay safe, and thanks for listening.